Hello and welcome everyone to the Women's Health Research and Action Center's first quarterly webinar on premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD. My name is Leah Chapman. I'm the founder and executive director of the Women's Health Research and Action Center, or WHRAC as we abbreviate it, and I'm going to be moderating today's session. So just two quick notes before we get started. Please stay on mute throughout the presentation, but if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. We're going to save the last 10 to 15 minutes or so of the webinar for a live Q&A. And then additionally, we will be sending the link of the recording out to all registrants later this week, so stay tuned for that. So I'm going to start with just giving a quick introduction to WHRAC to just give you some context for why we're hosting this webinar. And then I'm going to hand it over to our speaker today, Dr. Laetitia Meyrueix. So Laetitia, if you wouldn't mind jumping to the next slide. So WHRAC is a 501c3 nonprofit research organization dedicated to advancing women's health through research, storytelling, and community-driven support. We believe that women's health is underfunded and misunderstood, and that lived experience is data. It belongs right alongside with traditional studies and traditional forms of data. Every woman deserves to feel seen, heard, and cared for across every stage of life and every aspect of health. WHRAC was founded by women who've experienced firsthand the stigma, delays, and gaps in care that too often define women's health. Our vision is a healthcare system that listens to women, invests in their care, and responds with the research, resources, and respect that they deserve. Next slide, please. Our work spans three pillars: research, where we study underexamined issues in reproductive and hormonal health, from infertility and endometriosis to PMDD and pregnancy loss. Advocacy, where we translate those research findings into tools and policy conversations that make care more accessible and more equitable for women. And then finally, philanthropy, where we meet immediate needs through initiatives like our Cards of Comfort campaigns and our mental health microgrants, which are being rolled out in the future. Together, these three pillars let us bridge science and compassion so that data becomes action. Next slide, please. So here's a quick look at some projects that WHRAC is building. This isn't a comprehensive list. I just wanted to highlight a couple of them. So we're conducting a pilot study on exercise-triggered endometriosis pain, as well as a mixed method study combining both survey and interview data on the financial and social costs of inadequate fertility coverage. So this study is going to capture real-world sacrifices that people have to make when insurance benefits fall short for fertility care. And then some upcoming projects, we are building a stories as data repository where, alongside with community partners, we're going to be creating a searchable library of women's health experiences organized by condition, by the stage of life that they're in, and then their geographic region. And the goal of this is to turn narrative evidence into research insights, policy briefs, toolkits, and other resources for communities, policymakers, and clinicians. We're also working on launching a safe waiting spaces program, which will be a toolkit for clinics. For example, part of that toolkit will be offering resources for OBGYN clinics to do a service like curbside check-in for people experiencing infertility or pregnancy loss. That way they don't have to sit in wait in triggering spaces for their healthcare appointments. And then finally, we will be offering mental health microgrants, hopefully in the future. These will be small, rapid response support to bridge access to counseling or peer support groups during high stress moments. Next slide, please. So if our work resonates with you, there are lots of ways to connect. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. We have the QR code on this slide. You can follow us on Instagram, also have the QR code for that. Or you can volunteer your time or your skills. And we also welcome partnerships with clinics, researchers, and other organizations aligned with our mission. So I'd like to transition now into why we chose PMDD for our first webinar. PMDD is a condition that involves severe cyclical symptoms that can disrupt work, disrupt relationships, daily life, but yet it is underdiagnosed and often misdiagnosed. It sits at the intersection of hormonal and mental health, which is exactly where we need better data and clearer care pathways. And that's the kind of bridge that WHRAC is aiming to build, connecting evidence with lived experience and practical next steps. So with that, it is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Laetitia Meyrueix is an interdisciplinary scientist, children's health policy analyst, and passionate advocate for women's health. She holds a PhD in nutrition from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where her research focused on how environmental exposures and maternal health influence placental and fetal development through epigenetic mechanisms. Her commitment to women's health is both professional and deeply personal. Having navigated the challenges of PMDD herself and having witnessed the generational impact of under-researched conditions like endometriosis and reproductive cancers in her own family, Dr. Meyrueix is acutely aware of the consequences of research gaps in women's health. As a scientist, she understands how these gaps persist, and as an advocate, she is driven to help close them. Laetitia is one of WHRAC's scientific advisors. Through her work at WHRAC, she is dedicated to advancing research-driven, equity-centered solutions that protect and promote women's health. So thank you again, Laetitia, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leah, for that introduction. And again, welcome everyone to our first webinar. Really excited to lead off this inaugural quarterly webinar that we will be doing. I will be taking us through explaining a little bit of PMDD, and I will be also weaving in a little bit of my own narrative into this, but let's kind of go ahead and get started on that. I do want to have kind of what I'm determining as a mindful moment before we begin this presentation. Premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a very serious condition, and I will be talking about suicidal ideation. So if that is something that you, at this time point, cannot and do not want to hear, I totally respect that. And you are welcome to look at this recording another time, or maybe just hang on in there until maybe potentially this talk is no longer resonating with you, and that is more than understandable. Even preparing this presentation in a certain sense was triggering for my own self, so I totally understand. So no hard feelings, but just wanted to make sure that people were aware that I will be bringing this up. Alongside this, as Leah was kind of, sort of leaning into, WHRAC is very invested in women's health stories. And in this presentation, I will be weaving in my own personal narrative into some of the scientific evidence of PMDD. And I personally think that this is very important. And in the context of PMDD, I think it is particularly important because of the fact that this is such an under-researched and understood area of women's health. So I will be using my own experiences to highlight how important this is and how impactful having premenstrual dysphoric disorder can be. And within that narrative, of course, women's health and women's narratives are very important. And I want to make sure to really underscore that. And then finally, my last note, science is ever changing. So some of the information I may be presenting today may not stay true. Not to say that it was necessarily wrong, but that science is an ever evolving sort of field of study. And so considering that PMDD is so under-researched and so not understood, I do want to sort of add that asterisk that in case I end up saying things that eventually end up not necessarily being totally in line or do not represent all those who have PMDD, that is why. I am going to do my best to sort of address the spectrum of PMDD experiences, but I also understand that my PMDD experience is very unique to myself. So I may also not be capturing the full extent of what other people might be experiencing if they have this menstrual disorder as well. So I do want to add that huge asterisk as well. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll be sort of using my little lightning rod here, as I'm like going to call it, to kind of highlight a couple things. But Leah went ahead and did an excellent introduction, but I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time of also explaining my specific expertise. I do, as Leah said, have a PhD in nutrition, but my expertise spans further than just nutrition. I have expertise in environmental health, genetics, reproductive and developmental biology, and also recently I've added on toxicology, as I've recently finished a postdoctoral fellowship with the Environmental Protection Agency. So I really I've always approached science from an interdisciplinary perspective because I do believe that sometimes getting into niches closes our eyes to a lot of the other things that are going on. And I think that not only in children's health, which is where I've mostly positioned myself, but women's health is also another excellent example of a place that really requires us to think about things more holistically and not in our little silos. And alongside that, as Leah mentioned as well, I did find out during the end of my doctoral studies that I was suffering from premenstrual dysphoric disorder. All right, so before we get kind of started on the actual conversation of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which I will just start calling PMDD for short for now, I do want to kind of go over the menstrual cycle since that is such an important component of what PMDD is. And so, as many of you might be familiar or maybe not familiar, but the menstrual cycle is a chain of events that involves the brain, the ovaries, and the uterus. Those are the principal components that are involved in this. And all of these are linked together by hormones. And as a subtle reminder, hormones are chemical signals that are sent throughout the body. They are produced by various organs. I will go into the specific organs that are of importance for that in this discussion. And in the menstrual cycle, there are 4 key hormones that regulate the about 28-day cycle. This is a lot of information, but I am trying to sort of position ourselves to understand that there are various cycles within the greater cycle. So there is the ovarian cycle and there is the uterine cycle. I would even argue that there is a brain cycle, but that is very understudied. So we will not be getting into that conversation, but I am just sort of highlighting that as something to just think about as I'm talking through this. And for the context of PMDD, we will be focusing in on the ovarian cycle, and most importantly, what we term the luteal phase, which is the phase after ovulation, which is also known as the premenstrual phase. So to sort of, again, I am going to, for the sake of this discussion, kind of narrow down the focus. I understand that I'm not going to be discussing all components of the menstrual cycle, but to just get at the gist of what is important in the context of PMDD, we're going to simplify this a little bit. So in the menstrual cycle, there are 2 key phases, which is the ovarian cycle, which is differentiated into the follicular phase, which is the lead up to ovulation. And then there is the luteal phase, which is after ovulation. And that is what we will be focusing on for this discussion. So the follicular phase in general is largely regulated by 2 hormones, the follicular stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And those originate from the brain and communicate with the ovaries to prepare the ovaries to release an egg for ovulation and as well to prepare the uterus. So that is just general idea. Then in the luteal phase, the ovaries kind of take over on the hormone signaling, and we have predominantly progesterone and estrogen, which are also responsible for preparing the body for a potential pregnancy. And sort of the resolution of this cycle is either you become pregnant or you have your period, and then the cycle starts all over again. And I will just sort of really iterate that for the purposes of this discussion, we will be talking principally about estrogen and progesterone. All right, so as I've been highlighting, we are really focusing here on the luteal phase for premenstrual dysphoric disorder for PMDD, and predominantly we will be talking about estrogen and progesterone. In this diagram, the estrogen is in the blue, so this lovely little line that has 2 sort of peaks that end up happening during both phases. And then the progesterone, which is this green line. And what's really important to pay attention to here is that there are 2 sort of, I like to call them 2 humps that happen in the luteal phase. You have one of them that is estrogen and one of them that is progesterone. And this is very, very important in the context of understanding premenstrual dysphoric disorder. From the context that this change, this increase in progesterone and this increase in estrogen with then its decrease is a very important, it is the sort of driver of the effects of premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So bear that in mind. The rest of this is obviously could spend hours talking about this, but for just context of right now, just focus on luteal phase and just thinking about the 2 peaks of estrogen and progesterone. All right, so what is PMDD? So first off, PMDD is a cyclical hormone-based mood disorder. And PMDD represents a severe negative reaction to normal hormonal fluctuations in the menstrual cycle. And specifically, what I was attempting to highlight in the slide before, the rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone during the luteal phase, or what we also have termed the premenstrual phase. PMDD is represented by extreme mood shifts, and that can be seen as depression, anxiety, irritability, rage, feelings of being out of control, and it does include suicidal thoughts and ideation. And this arises relatively immediately, and it varies person to person, but relatively immediately after ovulation and will resolve once your period starts. To be clear, and this is very important because PMDD in its infancy was understood as being more of a hormonal imbalance. It is not a hormonal imbalance. Most women, of course, again, always exceptions, but generally speaking, women with PMDD have a negative reaction to what is a normal shift in estrogen and progesterone. And for further context, and for those of you who may not be familiar, and this is really important, not only for the sake of better understanding PMDD, but just for the context of how to treat PMDD as well. And this was a pretty important move to sort of highlight the importance of PMDD. But the DSM-5 is what the psychiatric field uses to diagnose various different mood disorders, and mental diseases or mental disorders. And so the PMDD was added to the DSM-5 relatively recently, which is a huge win for us, but I also will be returning back to this point later in the discussion, not necessarily to per se criticize, but just because I want to kind of bring up the nuances of what that might represent when we think about PMDD in the clinical context. All right. So to some guiding questions to think about as I'm sort of moving forward throughout this discussion, specifically to differentiate between premenstrual disorders, because I'm sure some of you are sort of thinking about PMS as I'm discussing all of this, but just kind of highlight at the back of your mind that when we're talking about PMDD, these are sort of the three guiding questions in general that we're thinking about. We're thinking about number of symptoms, we're thinking about severity of symptoms, and we are thinking about consistency of symptoms. So when I was kind of coming up with this presentation, because to be honest, as somebody with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, it can be really hard to explain. Only, for a number of reasons, but I think one of them principally is because if you are somebody who has a menstrual cycle, I've always resonated with all my friends because I will bring up all the things that I experience, and there's not a single one of my friends who has a menstrual cycle who has not been like, oh my God, like that's also happened to me, or if I felt like this. So it feels very complicated sometimes to explain that, like, yeah, I hear you, but mine is worse. And it's not to at all negate that other people who have menstrual disorder or menstrual cycles may not experience symptoms that are not at all pleasant. But I do want to sort of emphasize that there is a spectrum, and that is kind of why I've tried to utilize the moon to sort of go in with the feminine energy there. But I do want to kind of think about this as a spectrum. So in general, if you have a menstrual cycle, you will experience some of the symptoms at some point in your life that is associated with PMDD. But it is not necessarily PMDD. All right, so with that, as I've been kind of highlighting, and this is a term that I just kind of learned about, and I will be honest that I think probably over time this will change. But right now, there's this new scientific term of premenstrual bulimia to sort of describe what over 90%, about 90% of women will experience at least one premenstrual symptom at varying intervals across their lifespan. And just think that, like, as a person with a menstrual cycle, you have various phases of your menstrual cycle. So it is not a shock that at one point in time, you might have menstrual cycles that are a little bit harder to deal with than maybe decades before or decades after. So just kind of want to call that out. Then there is the infamous premenstrual syndrome. And so at this current point in our understanding of premenstrual syndrome, we do know that at least 75% of menstruators will experience a combination of premenstrual symptoms at some point of their life that could be considered PMS for short. But the differentiating factor here is that it will be for a certain phase of life, and it will be only a certain number of symptoms. And that will be labeled PMS. And this is not necessarily something that consistently stays throughout somebody's sort of reproductive lifespan. And finally, PMDD, which is sort of the end of this sort of moon phases spectrum. Right now, again, since this is relatively understudied, right now our estimations of how many people with menstrual cycles experience this is about 3 to 8%. And this is an experience of severe and debilitating menstrual symptoms. And I'll get a little bit more into what that actually means, but just kind of in your mind, again, think about number of symptoms, consistency of symptoms, and severity of symptoms. I will note that PMDD has often been confused with other conditions. One predominantly, quite a few menstruators who have PMDD have been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. And I'll share a little bit as to how that comes to be, because it is relatively understandable why that happens, but at the same time, very frustrating because that does not actually get to the root cause of what's going on. But for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with bipolar disorder is just characterized by very severe mood swings, which is something that in PMDD you can also experience. Alongside that, and this is sort of a new recognition within the premenstrual disorder field in general, is premenstrual exacerbation syndrome. No, I'm saying it wrong, but that's fine. PME. And this is where you already have a pre-existing psychiatric condition that does worsen premenstrually. So in a certain sense, it's not exactly per se PMDD, but the menstrual cycle is affecting your underlying psychiatric condition. And there are real reasons as to why this happens. And again, we will go over this a little bit more, but just trying to introduce these very different conditions to kind of go through how various things are actually diagnosed. All right, so to kind of tie in the story part of this, I will say from my own personal experiences of PMDD, you really do feel like you are living your life in a cycle. And the way that it manifested for me, it felt like I had 2 weeks where I was myself, where I felt relatively fine, chilled, like various stressors weren't necessarily sending me over the edge, like just sort of my normal, what I would term my normal status being, basically. Like I just felt normal. And then suddenly it would almost feel like something came out of the woodworks and I would just be taken over by a force is the only way to really describe it. And that for me manifested with 2 weeks out of the month where I really did not at all feel like myself. But the issue is that what you're experiencing is so real that it is in a certain sense you, even though it is happening to you and you're not the one that's like, yeah, you're not trying to be the way that you are when this is happening, but it is a little bit beyond your, in a certain sense, your capacity for it to not occur. And so it does, in a certain sense, can feel like bipolar disorder. And that is something that crossed my mind when I was going through my own sort of diagnostic steps to figuring out what was going on for me, because it feels like such severe changes. Like you feel like two different people in a month, and you also feel like your normal ability to react to things is gone. And I personally was very shocked to experience the kind of rage that sort of would occur to me during my luteal phase. So I just felt like 2 weeks out of the month that I was like absolutely out of control, was angered over the littlest things, just having very unreasonable reactions. And I say unreasonable sort of very loosely, because I do think they're reasonable reactions because what you're experiencing is real, but just if you compare yourself pre and post, you just really don't quite understand what's happening. And I think the thing was the most shocking of the experience is the fact that it just suddenly disappears. You get your period and then suddenly everything is fine again. And you get caught in this like very weird space where you're almost not sure if what happened the 2 weeks prior were real until it happens again. And then it starts all over again. And like you get really stuck in this cycle. And that's kind of why I titled this presentation so much on uncovering the cycle, because you really do get caught in what feels like a never-ending cycle, and where the only thing that sort of releases you from it is your period. So yeah, it's not a particularly fun experience whatsoever. And I think part of what makes this condition so hard to sort of like pinpoint is because it resembles so many other conditions. And if you don't think about the context of the menstrual cycle, it's so easily missed. And it is so driven by the menstrual cycle. And I know that personally, I only started putting it 2 and 2 together because I had an audience member to my own sort of monthly drama. And I feel like if I hadn't had somebody to kind of voice back to me what they were seeing on a more cyclical sort of pattern, I think it would have taken me even longer to figure out, especially since when seeking medical help to sort of try to figure out what was going on, I brought up PMDD. PMDD was never brought up to me. So this was really initiated by myself. I mean, the clinicians I saw understood that I was suffering, but it was me who kind of brought up this PMDD, and through that is how we came to the diagnosis. But I really genuinely feel like if my partner had not noticed that it had like sort of a cyclical nature to it, I think we would still be wondering what was happening to me. All right, so this is to go into sort of the diagnosis of PMDD and how it relates to the various other forms of premenstrual disorders. So the first question to sort of guide the diagnosis is, are the primary mood and other symptoms, whether that's anxiety, rage, depression, so on and so forth, are they happening during the luteal phase, and do they resolve shortly after menstruation? If the answer is yes, then you start asking questions of how many symptoms are present. And for the diagnosis of PMDD, you need at least 5 symptoms that are present and severe. And I'll kind of go into what severe means. And then finally, if the answer is yes, that there are at least 5 symptoms and they are severe, you can do a provisional diagnosis of PMDD, and then you will be asked to track your symptoms for at least 2 other cycles. And again, highlighting consistency. So PMDD is not something that just happens one-off. This is a consistent experience that happens every month unless there are different interventions. So if the answer is no, that it is not persistent and severe, then the answer would be that this is PMS, which again, this is where things can get a little bit confusing, because I do not want to at all take away from the fact that other menstruators also experience some pretty intense symptoms during their period. But if it is not consistent and it does not have the severity that we see in PMDD, then it is not PMDD and it is PMS. And PMS typically is not something that menstruators will experience throughout their whole life. It will happen in phases, and it will not necessarily be, again, the severity of the symptoms and also the number of symptoms. All right, so if we go back to the original question of does the primary mood and anxiety symptoms, do they exist only during the luteal phase, basically? And if the answer is no, then the sort of secondary question can be, do the symptoms worsen premenstrually? And so if the answer is yes, that is PME. And I'll explain this a little bit later, but I think that this is something really important to sort of notice, that PMDD and PME are sort of highlighting the fact that the menstrual cycle can have very intense impacts on menstruators. Whether that is because you just have PMDD, well, in quotations, just have PMDD, or you have PME and you have an underlying psychiatric disorder, there is something about the luteal phase, specifically the estrogen and progesterone rise and fall, that seems to affect a portion of people very intensely. And whether that is through PMDD or PME, there is definitely something going on to really intensify somebody's day-to-day experiences. And then obviously if the answer is that the symptoms do not worsen premenstrually, then it is not menstrually related. But I show all of this diagnosis obviously to highlight how you actually got diagnosed. But I'm also really wanting to highlight the fact that we really need to be thinking of the impact of menstrual cycles on women's health in general. PMDD is a very easier example because of the fact that it is so dictated by the menstrual cycle. But I think that PME really begs us to question how much other diseases like autoimmune diseases could be potentially impacted by the menstrual cycle. All right, so this is to kind of go a little bit more into the specific symptoms of PMDD. Here I've highlighted, and these are taken from the DSM-5. So these are the specific sort of like greater than or equal to 5 symptoms that you need to be highlighting. And I have a greater list to also show because there are so many symptoms. But the things that in general people are really looking for in the diagnosis of PMDD are these affective symptoms of, do you have angry outbursts? Are you getting unreasonably sort of irritable? Is your anxiety feeling totally out of control? Mood swings, or do you feel like you're sort of varying between highs and lows? Are you feeling more depressed? And then sort of this, I'm going to really highlight this feeling out of control, because I think that, at least from my own personal experience, that was the thing that really stood out the most to me, that I just felt like I was totally losing control over myself. And then, of course, because, all sort of things that affect the mind will affect other things that are going on in your life and in your body. So I can definitely speak that I felt like I was feeling incredibly lethargic, sleeping excessively, incredible brain fog, difficulty concentrating, no interest in anything except probably laying down. And that's about, yeah. And so these are sort of the other ones, and I will go into more of the physical symptoms because as somebody who experienced so many physical symptoms, I think it's very important to highlight that portion of that story. All right, so when we talk about severity of symptoms, we're talking about that these symptoms that I've highlighted and some are affecting you so much that it is causing you day-to-day distress and interfering with your work, school, and usual social activities and relationships with others. And to be specific and to weave my own experiences into this, for me, the way that it showed up is that I knew that 2 weeks out of the month, I could do absolutely nothing. And in a certain sense, I was fortunate that at the time that this was occurring, I was finishing up my doctoral studies. So it was a little bit, quote, easier to be under the radar. And I could, quote, get away with not having 2 active weeks out of every month. But on the flip side of that, that made every month so difficult because I had this hanging thing over my head of like, I knew that, in 2 weeks, I was not going to be able to do my usual activities. And it got to the point that my partner and I had to start sort of putting on our calendar to expect when I was going to be basically out of commission. And for my own self, I had to also plan around my, sort of premenstrual schedule and to ensure that like everything that I needed to do was done beforehand. And again, I was able to do that, and I'm lucky in a certain sense that that was possible, but that is not possible for most everyone. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to highlight. Sort of this is impacting you to the degree that you are not able to do your daily activities. And this includes relationships. And I will say as well, that this is something that I've seen happen with a lot of other menstruators with PMDD, that especially your intimate relationships really suffer because the anger and irritability can be so, beyond your control in a certain sense that it does impact the people around you. And I know that as I was kind of starting to get out, having my own partner be my audience member to this, I was very fortunate that he's a very patient person. And that he, was more interested in understanding why this was happening as opposed to sort of joining in the anger and irritability. But I can definitely imagine and understand that that can be very, very difficult to, be able to have, sort of quote normal conversations with your partner one portion of the month, and then another portion of the month you feel like you've lost all your bearing of being able to understand where they're at and their sort of normal reaction to things. So that is what severity sort of is meaning. And I know that I'm not covering at all everyone's experience of this, but just kind of sharing a little bit what that represented for me. And yes, and this is sort of just going back to the PME, that these symptoms are not merely sort of a increase of what you're already experiencing on a sort of regular basis. And then again, it's really important for the diagnosis of PMDD that there's the initial sort of you go to the doctor and you're not feeling well and you're highlighting that this is what you're experiencing, but then you're also highlighting over time that you are consistently having these symptoms. All right, and I really have to thank IAPMD for having such a great list of symptoms on here, because I feel like almost all of them are listed that I could remember experiencing. So one of the key things of PMDD is the emotional and mood changes. So it goes through all of these. And again, it shows up differently for everyone. But these are some of the very intense emotional and mood changes that can be experienced. There are also cognitive and psychological symptoms. As I was mentioning, the lack of concentration and lack of interest in daily activities was something I personally experienced. I also, as somebody who is relatively talkative, would also suddenly be mute and uncommunicative for 2 weeks out of the month. And it feels like you're just shut down. It just flips off and you are no longer able to express yourself or genuinely understand what is going on. On the physical and sensory side, this is definitely something that I can speak to maybe more than I would like to, but definitely, like, there are just absolutely so many physical symptoms. And it can vary within those 2 weeks. I know that I personally started keeping track and started seeing that there were specific days of the cycle where I would have very specific symptoms. So I think I've experienced pretty much all of these. The functional impairment, this is again more highlighting the severity of symptoms, that it's impairing your day-to-day life, and that you're not able to maintain employment or your relationships, and you're finding yourself having to reorganize your entire life over the fact that you are basically out of commission for 2 weeks out of the month. And then finally, just to really take note, that PMDD, again, is a very, very serious condition. It can lead you to have suicidal ideation, and there are unfortunately many of our menstruating peers who have PMDD who have taken their life because of PMDD. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that, because it's not a joke. It's really not a joke. This would require an entirely separate long discussion, but I'm just going to briefly go over some of the current hypotheses around what causes PMDD. One, pretty obvious one is, and they've started highlighting some of this in some of the preliminary research on PMDD, but there seems to be a difference in brain structure and function with those who experience PMDD. So there is an underlying sort of structural difference in brains. Another one is that it has been noticed that it seems to be a relatively heritable condition. So people are definitely emphasizing the role of genetics and potentially epigenetics in the role and manifestation of PMDD. As I was highlighting, we do know at least that most, if not all, of what people experience in the context of PMDD is largely driven by progesterone and estrogen. The why and how is not necessarily totally understood, but we do have some information about progesterone and estrogen that has helped us to sort of start connecting dots. So for example, we have started seeing that in those with PMDD, there's a particular metabolite of progesterone. I'm not going to say the whole complicated name, but it's known shortly as allo. But there are varying levels of that metabolite in those with premenstrual dysphoric disorder. For estrogen is really important for serotonin regulation. And this is one of the reasons that those with PMDD can also get on SSRIs. And SSRIs are so effective because they are part of that pathway. So again, highlighting that we're really grazing the surface. We do know at least some of the key activators of this, but we don't necessarily know the full extent of how they're leading to all of this, but these are some of the beginnings of the research. The other branch of this, which I, from my own personal experience of PMDD, find particularly interesting, is they have been definitely noticing that those with PMDD have prior relatively traumatic experiences, and that the response to stress with those with PMDD is very, very different. And the way that it at least manifested for me personally is it does seem that, you know, none of us enjoy stress. I don't want to say that, but it does seem that those with PMDD are particularly sensitive to stress, and specifically on these axes, the hypothalamic pituitary and adrenal axis, as well as the hypothalamic pituitary and gonadal axis. And those are all axes that help our body regulate and respond to stress. And it does seem that those with PMDD have either some sort of change in the axis, or maybe the hormones are changing the axis. There is something about those axes and that ability to respond to stress that is different. And I know that within the sort of PMDD interventions that you can do, one of the very highlighted one is a lifestyle intervention of removing stress, which if only we could totally do that in our lives. But I will say that from my own personal experience and sort of gathering that information, putting it all together, I have noticed to what degree that if I control the stress in my life to the best extent that I can, I have seen remarkable improvements in my own experience of PMDD. What that actually represents biologically, I cannot say as of yet, but I do think there is something particularly interesting in that space. All right, so to kind of return back to that little disclaimer I had at the beginning of this presentation in discussing that PMDD is in the DSM-5, so it is considered at this time point, technically speaking, a psychiatric condition. And there has been a lot of controversy of whether to label it this or that. As an interdisciplinary person, I don't think it actually matters. I think it's more that what matters the most is understanding the nuances. This PMDD does have severe mood components to it. So your brain is definitely a part of this story. However, it is not necessarily inherently originating in your brain, at least at the way that we can comprehend it at this time being. So the way I like to think about PMDD, at least with the information that I have available to me and my own personal experiences, is there is, and a pretty intense communication that's happening between the brain and the ovaries. And as we discussed previously, the brain sends to the ovaries the follicular stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone for that first phase of the ovarian cycle. And then during the secondary phase of the ovarian cycle, the luteal phase that we've been talking about, we have estrogen and progesterone that are the key players in this. And so I think when we're thinking about this, as much as this is affecting the brain, it is originating, as far as we know, in the ovaries. And we know that from interventions that happen, that those with PMDD choose to take, like chemical menopause or hysterectomies that remove the ovaries, that they do find relief. They do find relief. So it does beg us to think about the role the ovaries are playing, specifically estrogen, progesterone. And I also bring this up because, estrogen, we think of it principally as something that helps the uterus and prepares for pregnancies and for mammary development and all that stuff. But estrogen has like pretty intense effects on the body of any person who menstruates. It plays a role in muscles and bones and cardiovascular. So it's a whole body hormone. It is not exclusively just a hormone of the ovaries. And I think that, at least from my personal experience, that helps to explain to me that my sensitivity is not necessarily just in my brain reacting to estrogen, but my whole body reacting to estrogen as well. Because I felt that I had so many pains, aches, just like bloating. It was just like, it just very excessive, sort of, it felt like an excessive reaction. I don't want to make it sound like that's bad. That's just your body reacting. But it just felt like whole body. The progesterone side is a little bit more complicated to directly connect to sort of a whole body experience, only because the progesterone levels that we have during our menstrual cycle are not at all the levels that we see when you're pregnant. However, just for the sake of sort of this hypothesis driving discussion here, we know that progesterone when you're pregnant has whole body effects. Even though it will be predominantly produced by the placenta and the levels are definitely much higher than when you are menstruating, we know that progesterone is very important for preparing the body for a pregnancy. And this is something that I would love to kind of see in the future, people considering what progesterone's effects are on somebody who is just, quote, just menstruating. And because of the progesterone's whole body effects, I really also question to what degree progesterone is not only affecting the brain, which we already are seeing that, but how it affects some of the other sort of symptomologies that we see in PMDD. And so my basic conclusion, and what I hope some of you will take from this, and it's totally okay if you feel differently from this, but I would really argue that this is a sort of neuroendocrine issue. It is not purely psychiatric and it is not purely hormonal. It is a combination thereof. And I would even argue that it goes beyond just that. But for the sake of right now, since those are the two sort of main organs that we've been able to identify, brain and ovaries, I will just sort of leave at it that it's a neuroendocrine. And I think it's really important from a intervention standpoint that PMDD is in the DSM-5, but I don't want that to be limiting. I don't want that for that to be the only label to it, because I think it does PMDD a disservice to be purely labeled as just a psychiatric condition. So that is my sort of leading remark on that. So to kind of go through, and again, this is not an a totally inclusive list. There is much more, but I think one of the most important things that anyone can do with anyone experiencing PMDD is just understanding and validating that person's experience. Because already, if you are somebody who is experiencing PMDD, you already feel out of control. And I feel like I personally felt like I experienced such amnesia, like from month to month. Like I almost felt like I was shocked every month that this was happening again, because it just, I mean, in a certain sense, I felt like I was trying to protect myself from the reality of what was actually going on. But it is just so important to have somebody there who sees you, who understands what you're, and it is really validating your feelings of being like out of control and feeling not well. The other portion, which I mean, I think everyone is pretty familiar with, but access to care and access to effective care. And I think that with many under-researched and conditions that are not understood, PMDD falls into that, and it can be very, very difficult to get the care that you need. I will give a shout out again to IAPMD, because thanks to their resource list that they had available, I was able to identify a provider that actually had experience in PMDD. But that took me 2 years of figuring all of that out before I found a clinician who had experience and was able to officially diagnose me with that. And alongside that, effective treatment. I'm very fortunate that my PMDD is responsive to birth control. So that means that once my period disappears through birth control methods, I am able to basically be as unsymptomatic as possible at this time point. That is not the case for many other menstruators who have PMDD. Sometimes there needs to be more, I guess, intense interventions than that. And although it is really important that those exist and that people have those avenues, it is so important that we have more of the sort of lower hanging fruit interventions, and that there's more availability before people do things like going into chemical menopause or having to fully do a hysterectomy to remove the ovaries. So we do need more of those in-between interventions. Another key point, and I think this could be argued for all menstruators, I think we need a lot more awareness of the impacts of the menstrual cycle period, because I think that everyone could benefit who is a menstruator with a little bit more awareness and understanding and flexibility as it relates to the fact that every month we are experiencing this, and some months we might have worse symptoms than others. And I think that some people have started arguing for special days that you can take off in the workplace or at school for for your cycle. And I would definitely argue for the context of PMDD that would be incredibly helpful and important to have a little bit more flexibility and understanding regards to taking time off for that. And then finally, as I've been kind of sharing with the importance of my own partner's support during the sort of diagnosis and beyond diagnosis, social and emotional support is so important. Just like many mental disorders, PMDD can be incredibly isolating and unfortunately self-isolating, just because it's very hard to function, much less maintain relationships. And so it cannot be underscored to what degree the social and emotional support from others, whether that is a therapist or your friends or your family, it is so important. And then with that, I will quickly go through some resources and kind of end our talk. But as I have been calling out, IAPMD is an amazing resource. It's the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders, and this was the one resource that I was able to find that only helped me understand the full extent of what PMDD is, but also helped me to advocate better for my own care. So huge shout out to this organization for all the work that they've been doing and all the resources that they provide. Alongside that, I've highlighted a few books, two of them that I've specifically read and one that was recently recommended. Thank you, Sandy. So just wanted to kind of highlight that. Aside from that, these are the main ones that I have found that I personally recommend. There are definitely more beyond this, but this is what I personally feel comfortable from my own experience sharing with y'all. And then finally, I will end again on WHRAC. This inaugural talk is part of our efforts to start doing research in the area of menstrual disorders. So this will not be the first or last time you hear us talking about menstrual disorders in general. So please take a visit to our website, follow us on Instagram, keep up with us. We are really hoping to expand, to encompass as many women's health issues as we can, and we're very motivated to include menstrual disorders into our program. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I will end there.
Thank you so much, Laetitia. This was a fantastic presentation, and thank you for sharing your story and your experiences with us. So we're going to open it up for questions now. You are welcome to use the raise your hand feature or come off mute, type your question into the chat. And there are already a couple in the chat. I think I may have seen a raised hand as well. Oh no, it was a thumbs up. Okay, so we'll go ahead and read the questions in the chat. Keep the questions coming, and between questions, feel free to come off mute as well. So Laetitia, the first question is, thank you so much for sharing your story and for providing these symptoms in such detail. My apologies if I missed this, but do you know how common PMDD is, or if there's enough data to be able to accurately know how common it is for menstruating people?
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for the question. So right now, the current evidence is estimating between 3 to 8% of menstruators experience PMDD. But I definitely, as a scientist, say that a little bit with caution, because this is a very burgeoning field of research. So I don't know that we are accurately estimating at this time point, especially from a global health perspective as well. I'm not sure that we actually know. I would assume that it is not a condition that affects a predominant majority of menstruators, but I do believe that it probably affects more people than we could imagine at this time point. So I would say the 3 to 8% is probably an underestimation, but I say that very timidly a little bit, just because I think we need a lot more research to truly capture how much this is impacting people. But great question.
Thanks, Laetitia. And I feel like that's always the answer that us researchers love to give. We need more research, we need more data. Okay, next question is, thank you for sharing your experience, knowledge, and openness with us, Laetitia. Given the differences in the HPA and HPG axis, it sounds like there may be a correlation between PTSD and PMDD. Do you know of any clinical pathways that screen menstruating people with PTSD for PMDD?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think even I've been reading a little bit more about this because I have wondered myself that same question. So amazing question. Thank you for bringing it up. But I also wonder, as it relates to chronic PTSD as well, there have been a little bit more chit chats. And again, this is very my own observations and my own sort of interactions with others who have PMDD, but I do feel like there is something to be said about the connection between PTSD and PMDD. Um, I do not currently know of any pathways that would screen for that. I'm assuming that in theory, if you are being diagnosed with PTSD and that you then bring up the fact that you feel like your symptoms of PTSD are more severe during your menstrual cycle, that would be technically a diagnosis of PME. But how much that's actually happening at this time point, I genuinely have no idea. And I think that that would be a very important, larger component of this story. And especially, again, why it's so important for us to, of course, highlight PMDD, but also highlight in general that there may be others that have something that is, PMDD adjacent, which is that they have this underlying condition that is then made worse during the premenstrual cycle. And I think there is something intensely going on in those conditions. So I think that is a great question. You're really hitting the ball on that one. But I think that we're way too at the beginning of this story to do it. But I see no reason why PTSD could not already be included into this.
Thank you, Letitia. So we do have a comment, and I would love for you to address this, Letitia. And the person who made this comment, please feel free to come off mute because we want this to be, a safe space where we can learn together. But they say, thank you for an excellent and informative presentation. One small quibble as a humanist and as a psychologist, I find the term menstruator dehumanizing for women. Thank you again for sharing that. And Letitia, do you have any thoughts or maybe some ideas for how to better use language in a presentation like this?
Yeah, no, I feel like, language is so important. And I feel like, yeah, even myself, I use menstruator because I want my goal is to be inclusive of the fact that not all people who menstruate are necessarily women, or identify as women. But I totally understand what you are bringing up, and I would definitely be open to other ways to talk about this. But I think that in general, my goal is, yeah, was to be more inclusive. So if it feels like I'm not, I'm definitely really trying to think of other ways. But I think for me, since I guess in this presentation, the reason menstruation was or menstruator was chosen is because I am talking about the menstrual cycle, and I'm not necessarily inherently just talking about women who menstruate. I'm talking about all people who menstruate. So that is where I came from, but I'm more than happy to, yeah, if there's other language that is better. I mean, again, I guess this could be added on that language is ever changing and science is ever changing. So I'm always happy to have better use of language. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, thank you so much. We're always looking to learn. And I am going to go ahead and put my email into the chat in regards to this comment, and maybe we can connect on this later offline.
And then I think I saw another question about the phase of the menstrual cycle to watch out for and when symptoms are much worse or better. Yes. So the phase of the cycle that is the sort of pièce de résistance of PMDD is the luteal phase or the premenstrual phase. So specifically after ovulation, and usually symptoms for PMDD will show up a few days after ovulation and will stay around until you menstruate, and it will take, it could take a couple days after you start your period to really start feeling better, especially from the sort of mood symptoms. So those are the key ones to look out for. So basically after ovulation and then after your period are the two key time points.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions into the chat. Do you know if you can still have PMDD after a partial hysterectomy, ovaries left in place?
Yeah, so my understanding is that because it is the ovaries that produce estrogen and progesterone, not necessarily always exclusively for estrogen, but because it is the ovaries, if the ovaries are not removed, it is my understanding that people can still have the symptoms of PMDD. And I know that from my understanding of other people's experiences, if the ovaries are not removed, then during the hysterectomy, then yeah, it can be problematic. On the other hand, I did kind of note that estrogen is not necessarily just produced by the ovaries. So potentially even people could continue having symptoms even after that. And I think that's kind of why this gets very complicated, especially on the person-to-person level, because every person's experience of PMDD is going to be so different. So it's going to call for different levels of interventions. So it is possible. There is always a possibility, but my understanding is the ovaries need to be removed for it to be more effective or more likely to be effective.
Thank you. Can you provide any insight into the potential links between ADHD and PMDD?
Yes, that is an amazing question. And I will also sort of add on to that question that autism has also been brought up in the discussions of PMDD. So yes, so I think with ADHD, there are similar access points that are related to PMDD, and from sort of personal experience and also hearing other people's experiences, it does seem that there is potentially a linkage with those who experience ADHD and therefore might be more likely to have PMDD. There's also already research highlighting that those with autism might be more likely to also have PMDD. And I think that relates back to the question about the HPA and HPG access, because we know that in ADHD and autism, the nervous system works differently. And so one could maybe surmise that in that sort of difference of neurodivergence, that potentially if you already do have ADHD, you're more likely to get PMDD because your nervous system is already more sort of reactionary to normal processes that are happening. So there's definitely potentially a link. I don't know that there is necessarily research yet. And I personally have looked more at the research between autism and PMDD, just because for my own, that made a little bit more sense immediately to me. But I see no reason as to why ADHD would not also be included into that. So great question.
Thank you. We have one final question, and I think this is a really nice one to end our discussion today. Do you believe women's mental health is overlooked more so than men's? If so, how do you think we can overcome this issue, especially when reviewing and overcoming insurance issues?
Yeah, so I think this is an amazing question. And I will say that I think that mental health, period, is overlooked. Now, when you get into gender differences, I think there are nuances and subtleties to it. I do personally believe that women's mental health is overlooked. And I think more specifically, what I feel is that our symptoms and our experiences are not taken seriously. So even though women are more likely to seek medical care in comparison to men, I feel that even in seeking more medical care in comparison to men, we are also taken much less seriously. Because on the converse, I would argue that, men's mental health is also overlooked, but that is also because they are not necessarily seeking that mental health support. However, if they do seek that mental health support, it is taken a little bit more seriously. And this probably goes into way too much history, but my personal sort of belief, especially with conditions like PMDD, is that not only obviously have they been real for a very long time, but that they've been categorized into the infamous category of women hysteria, female hysteria. And I think that anything that related to our reproductive systems, our monthly cycles have historically been not taken seriously and been seen as sort of the feminine dramatics, and not seen as like a very real and potentially debilitating set of symptoms and experiences. So yes, and how do we overcome that issue? I think, first and foremost, awareness. I think, even looking back, and I grew up in California, so I feel like in general, menstrual cycles were maybe discussed a little bit more than is common. But the fact that, even growing up, it's like weird, it's even weird to bring up your menstrual cycle, right, in a work environment because it's seen as unprofessional and just like not the place to do it. And although I may agree to an extent of the fact that like, yeah, you shouldn't just come in every day and be like, I'm on X day of my cycle. However, I do think that with women being, 50% of the population, or menstruators or people who menstruate being 50% of the population or more, that is a real thing we do every day. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be talking about it more. So I think if we talk about it more, that will help. And then the sort of asterisk to that will be the fact that women just need to be taken more seriously.
Thank you so much. I think that was a fantastic concluding question. So thanks everyone for your wonderful questions and for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn more about RAC and PMDD, and we really hope that you stay connected with us. Please join our newsletter, follow us on Instagram so you don't miss our next quarterly webinar. And if you have any ideas for future topics or future speakers that we should invite, we would love to hear from you. Just send us a note. Our email is info@rac.org. You can find it on our website, which the QR code will take you to our website on this slide. So thank you so much, everyone. And I'm going to stop the recording here and have a great rest of your day.